Welcome everybody again. Prasanna and I are recording this because after the webinar last week, we weren't able to get all the questions out, and so we wanted to do a follow-up to answer those questions, but also Prasanna, I wanted to see if you'd like to start with an update, if there's anything since last week that you feel you'd like to talk about, or if there's something from last week that you would like to go into a little bit more depth.
Thanks, Marcus. I guess in terms of updates, there isn't a huge amount to report back. I think what has happened since I gave my talk is that there's been a lot more of a sense, both in the media and amongst experts, that this is indeed a very large crisis, and that the consequences are very much like I described in my slides. One where one has to really seriously debate the length of the lockdown that we can sustain before it becomes too economically costly. I think a lot of the actual measures that governments have put in place remain, so I don't think there's any news there. The one thing I didn't get a chance to cover in the talk was really the links to supply chain management. I'll just mention them too. The slides are available now. But I think, as I was hinting at in my slides, there's a lot to learn from the way policymakers tackle the global financial crisis. So there's a parallel between banking and supply chain management. In particular, I think the way, if you go back to the global financial crisis, one of the concerns was the desire to make banks resilient. And so a lot of effort in the last decade has been around ensuring that banks have substantial capital buffers. The analog for supply chain management, of course, is essentially having buffers in hand, whether it's through mandated national supplies or stockpiles of reserves. I think the just-in-time technology that has driven supply chain management, that model is needs to be sort of rethought to sort of handle systemic events like this. And another aspect of banking, or the banking response to the crisis, was really about diversification. A lot of banks during the GFC were very exposed to particular sectors. All banks looked the same. And so as a result, the ecosystem of banks wasn't terribly resilient. And we found that to our cost in the global financial crisis. And I think similarly, supply chain management needs to think about that as well. A lot of supply chains are sort of ex-China. And so there's an issue about diversification of those supply chains. And I think that's an important consideration. So the just-in-time model needs to sort of learn to be a bit more adaptive, and need to sort of think about these kinds of systemic responses. And I think that was really what I failed to get across in the last few minutes of that talk. But I think there's a lot of parallels that supply chain management scholars and practitioners can get from the GFC if they look at how the policy community responded to that event.
So given that supply chains and the way we do trade is closely linked to globalization, how do you see the future of globalization moving forward?
I think there are lots of risks with globalization. I think there is a interesting confluence of events going on. There's a sort of rise of populism in places like the US, but elsewhere in Europe and so forth. And these, in a way, this is echoes of the Great Depression. I mean, that event also led to a rise in protectionism, and that actually made the economic situation even worse. And I think we need to guard against that. But my own sense is that we'll probably go back in a way, perhaps a decade or two, maybe flying will be a little bit more like the 1970s, where isn't quite like hopping on a bus anymore. You might take a trip once every few years, as families might have done in the 1970s. So I think from the trade side, I think globalization, there are enough forces to kind of continue the globalization trend, though one has to be wary of that. But at a sort of labor mobility level, I think it's going to be curtailed for a while. So we'll have to see especially as people discover new technologies to compensate for that mobility. You can be in other places without flying there.
As we are doing right now, of course.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So during the GFC, of course, it was the banking system that had to be bailed out. And here, of course, we're seeing impacts across multiple sectors, multiple industries, tourism notably, and everything associated to that. Is there capacity, do you think, to bail out all the different areas of the economy that need bailing out?
I think there's certainly some capacity to bail out a fair chunk of important industries. I mean, I was just looking today. The Australian government, for example, is basically going to cover, has announced that it's going to cover Qantas's and Virgin's costs for a limited network. So that's an example of essentially being a purchaser of last resort, by effectively buying all the tickets that would have been bought on those routes. And as I said in my talk, the capacity for countries or in the advanced world to issue debt is pretty substantial. And in some cases, like the UK, the central bank is essentially financing it by printing money to some limited degree. So I think there's a lot of fiscal space, and it's not going to be a complete return and a complete blanket subsidy for everybody. But I think important chunks of key sectors can be preserved and subsidized fairly well. And I think the burden of that increased debt, if you like, can also be sustained because, as I said, the real interest rate is 0 to negative, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. And it's going to be a sustainable situation.
So here in New Zealand, our two biggest export earners have traditionally been tourism and agriculture. And as I just mentioned, tourism is going to take a hit. What do you think may happen to agriculture in terms of our export earnings, and how much of what happens is dependent on people's and countries' sort of attitude change, i.e., is it likely that China might also decide to be a little bit more self-sufficient in terms of its milk or agricultural products, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to say. I mean, we know that we're going to have a great recession. We know that incomes everywhere are going to decline. So the demand for New Zealand exports, by definition, will taper off. I mean, lamb in New Zealand, lamb is not going to sell as well in the UK as it would otherwise. And so I think there will, and although the exchange rate will depreciate, it hasn't depreciated a great deal. And it's important to bear in mind that all the other exchange rates have depreciated as well. So relatively speaking, we're not that far away from where we actually are at the moment. So it's really the income shocks to these countries overseas who purchase our exports. And I'm not a trade economist, so I don't have a magic answer to that question, but I would have thought that there would be some decline. The prices of commodities, soft commodities that New Zealand exports, lamb and milk and so forth, will probably decline a little, and that will be an offset. But I think on the whole, our terms of trade will decline and there will be a reduction in our standards of living. Now, the issue also for our export industry here is the extent to which they're able to service their debts in this current environment, because in the milk industry, for example, is fairly well known for having reasonably a reasonably leveraged state. So they're not going to be as resilient as they were. And so I'm not sure how much, I think that's something to watch, because I think if demand falls overseas and commodity prices fall by a larger than expected amount, then you could see farmers and so forth getting into financial distress. And then they would have to sort of work out debt forgiveness with their banks, and the capacity of the banks in turn to provide that debt forgiveness depends, of course, on the state of the economy. So it's a sort of fragile picture, I think.
Sure. I'm going to go into some of the questions that were asked at the end of the seminar last week. So the first question, what activities do you see permanently leaving the economy once and for all post-COVID-19?
Right. I mean, I think it's going to be a case of social consumption activities are going to be the ones that are going to be hardest hit so by that I mean movies, restaurants, those kinds of sectors where you will see a lot of firms struggling, because I think it will be a very long time, and also the transition that they will have to incur to sort of survive in a post-COVID world where until a vaccine is out will actually be very difficult for them to sustain that model. So I think it's really social consumption activities that will really decline, cinemas and the like, because they're the sort of they rely on that level of social congregation to be cut out. So I think they're the main ones. But then on the flip side, I think in the longer term, I think there's going to be, as we shift much more towards dare I call it, a weightless economy, there's going to be a premium on high tech and high skill going forward. So I think some sectors like education, for example, will do well, and so there will be winners and losers in this. And it's hard to sort of anticipate which sectors will be worse hit than others, but my tip would be social consumption.
Okay, thank you. And what kind of differential impacts may be felt from balance of trade perspectives with regards to vis-a-vis net export and import? So what kind of trade balance or imbalance are we likely to see?
Well, I mean, for a start, I mean, I would expect New Zealand to run a fairly hefty current account deficit and a trade imbalance. Why is that? Well, certainly, if you think about the current account first, there's going to be a huge amount of government dissaving. The government's going to be borrowing. And the New Zealand private sector, corporates and households have also borrowed a huge amount. So you'd expect a large current account deficit. Similarly, incomes overseas and domestically have declined. So we're going to be importing, we'll probably import similar amounts. I mean, or certainly, I think that will decline, but I guess there'll be some pent-up demand as we come out of lockdown. So immediately you might see a bounce in imports as everyone buys their BMW, which they've been hanging out for in the last 4 weeks. But thereafter, I think you'll see a reduction of, the income effect will kick in with a vengeance, and imports will decline. And the best one can really hope for is that net exports stay stable, as I discussed earlier, where, depending on how exchange rates and commodity prices move, exports hopefully are reasonably placed, but you'd imagine imports would decline. So difficult to tell exactly how the trade balance will shape up. It'll depend on the exchange rate. commodity prices. So, but I think the income effect is going to drown out a lot of things.
Right, right. So we have another sort of globalization question here. To what extent could this pandemic affect the medium run trend of globalization? Will it stimulate protectionism, do you think?
Well, I think I touched on that in my earlier answer. I think there are already forces of protectionism, and I think they will increase because I think the COVID, a lot of things, just as crises can be opportunities, they're also an opportunity for what you might call miscalcitrant behavior. The fog of crisis allows all kinds of undesirable activities included. And you can easily, for example, Hungary is a classic example where they have become much more authoritarian in the face of this crisis. And so the risks of that are real. The risks that protectionism rears its head because you can have problems of, you can easily see Brexit, which has now been forgotten, becoming more of an issue as nation states, look at each other in a very nationalistic way rather than an internationalistic way. And the European project itself is at risk. So all these things can play out. So populism and nationalism and protectionism all go hand in hand. And so I think there's a real risk there. So it's, I think this is where I was getting at with my quote with Henry Kissinger at the end of my slides, which unfortunately we didn't get to, where, policymakers really do have to keep an eye out for the future. And you do require some wisdom there, because already, even now, you've seen Donald Trump say that he doesn't want to fund the World Health Organization. This is an example. The Americans have also put up resistance against debt relief for advanced economies. This doesn't all go well for a multinational world and multinational solutions, which is kind of what you want in this kind of environment. So I think it's the risks for globalization are real, both forced by the pandemic, but also because of these other forces. I think so. I think you'll see an unwinding of it.
Yes,
it won't be as free as it was a few months ago.
Using usual measures of the value of a statistical life, how many statistical lives have we paid for with a 1 month long lockdown in New Zealand? What do you expect the cost of a partial lockdown to be post the level 4 complete shutdown?
Now
that's a tricky question.
It's a tricky question. It's a question that I don't have an answer to. I think there are people who have opined on this in the media already. It's not. One can come up with different ways of measuring the pros and cons of a lockdown, whether it's in terms of statistical lives or foregone output. I don't pretend to know the answer to that question. I think, but equally, I think I'm comfortable saying that nobody knows the answer to that question either. There is no right or wrong answer as to whether a 4-week lockdown or a 6-week lockdown or a 2-week lockdown is the right one. I mean, I think, we can all kind of form views, and hindsight will be a wonderful thing when we look back at this episode. But it's difficult to say, and I think different countries are taking very different approaches. The UK is announcing another 3 weeks of lockdown. Statistical lives versus, because they're diffuse, are less upfront in the minds of the electorate and the politicians. So, the politician concerned with their longevity in office is going to focus on current lives rather than statistical lives. So there are lots of factors that determine what an optimal lockdown is. I don't think you can answer that question in a sort of black and white way.
Yeah, it does seem to me though that there's a balance to be struck between the economic impacts on people's health, even due to the lockdown, and the longevity of the lockdown, versus the risks and impacts of COVID-19.
Yeah.
And where do we hit that?
Well,
the point of no return, where the lockdown is worse than the virus itself.
Well, I mean, this comes back to the motives of the politicians, right? Because they're the ones who decide on the length of the lockdown, and they, of course, care only about, as I said, their longevity in office. At a first order. I mean, they're not. They're going to discount those longer term issues of mental health because they matter less because to those politicians, because they will be long gone by the time those problems manifest. So the incentive is for the politician is to lengthen this lockdown. Look tough, look in control, save current lives because they're the headline figures. So you'll end up with an overshoot. The lockdown will probably last longer and stay longer than is probably optimal if you take all those other factors into account. But equally, I suspect you wouldn't go, down a Swedish model which says no lockdown whatsoever. And
okay. Well, speaking of the Swedish model, then. What do you know about sort of the latest information of what's happening in Sweden in terms of either economic impact or rates of infection, etc.?
I haven't followed Sweden that closely since our talk, so it's certainly sort of, I think when we last spoke, it was around about 600 in terms of deaths, but I haven't followed closely the reproduction rates there or the increase in the curve.
Yeah.
So
as you mentioned in your last talk, of course, this is going to be something that economists are going to be able to study for decades.
Exactly. I think it's a very nice natural experiment, as economists call them, and I think the outcomes will be studied.
I did read somewhere, this was an article written by a Swedish journalist, saying that actually what they're doing is not unusual. They're sort of following procedures. It's the rest of the world that is taking a risk and doing something which is completely novel and that has never been done before. Another question here. With the recent exclusion of academic, monetary, or even macro economists from New Zealand's MPC, is there a threat of inflation coming from COVID-19? And can you explain what MPC is, please?
Okay, so MPC is a Monetary Policy Committee, which is the group of people that sets the interest rate for the central bank. So just to explain to the audience, the Reserve Bank is independent and by virtue of its independence gets to set the interest rate on the policy interest rate. Now, traditionally until this Labour government, the interest rate or the decision on monetary policy was made by a single individual, namely the governor of the Reserve Bank. Over time and following trends in other countries, the thinking has been that leaving all this independent authority to a single individual runs the risk of narrow thinking and, of course, exposes society to the opinions of one individual. And a lot of countries have sort of sought to rectify this by having committees, formal statutory committees that are independent and are accountable to Parliament for their actions and their votes. And New Zealand has kind of gone down that road, though not entirely, by having some members of the monetary policy, some kind of policy committee, but one that's not accountable in quite the same way as it is in other countries such as the UK. Noticeably, this particular committee has been devoid of, and quite deliberately so, the Reserve Bank said they wanted a representative committee, and by which they meant not necessarily more macroeconomists. And so they have sought to have a broader committee to reflect a more diverse set of opinions. Will it be inflationary? Probably not. Partly because of the nature of the shock. The shock is probably profoundly deflationary. So if anything, the central bank has the opposite problem. I think the risk actually is more that you have people who are not necessarily expert, who make wrong policy choices in a different kind of way. But I don't think inflation is going to be a problem for any of the advanced economies for the next 5 or 6 years. So in that respect, I don't think that's their problem. I think their problems will be somewhat different. It's how should they deal with the deflationary shock, and also the other change the Reserve Bank that was made to the Reserve Bank here was prior to this government, the Reserve Bank's mandate was only to focus on inflation. With the current government, they have changed the mandate to include employment. So the mandate now for the governor and the Monetary Policy Committee is to also set interest rates with an eye to employment. And so given that the employment or unemployment is going to rise sharply and there's going to be a severe impact on employment, the challenge for this committee will actually be to set interest rates in a way that softens the blows on unemployment rather than worrying about inflation per se.
Okay. A hypothetical situation concerning debt. Unlimited quantitative easing and high fiscal spending builds inflationary pressures that are unrealized due to the lockdown and limited household spending. When the lockdown ends, households begin to spend again, and we suddenly realize widespread inflation exacerbated by supply shortages. Monetary policy lifts off the ZLB to address this inflation, but the government and households are burdened with COVID debt. Servicing costs increase. What are your thoughts? So you've just said that we're going into a deflationary period. So, but any other thoughts around this situation?
Well, there are 2 points. One is, I mean, I'm not so sure that there will be a massive spend. I mean, there is deficient demand because households are locked up and they can't spend. So there will certainly be some spending when they come out. But also remember what I was saying about the psychological scarring effects of a crisis. People are going to be, the precautionary motive of people in this environment where jobs are less secure and incomes are less secure is going to make them think a lot harder about their spending decisions. So you may not necessarily see people rushing out and engaging in lofty spending. They may spend on essential items, but if you're not sure about your job prospects, or if you've been told that you have to take a 20% salary cut because the Prime Minister has done so, that's going to curb your instinct to spend quite considerably. So that's one point that I would make. A little bit of inflation is probably no bad thing in this context, if it did happen, because inflation is a sort of genteel way, if you like, of essentially defaulting on some of those debts or eroding some of the face value of the debts that the corporates and the households face. So some inflation will be no bad thing. So it's not something that one be too concerned about if that was. In fact, I think that would be a happy situation if we had 4 or 5% inflation. Strangely enough.
Okay. So you mentioned throughout this conversation that we're going into probably into more protectionist type scenarios around either socially but economically as well. And so I'm just wondering about New Zealand and your thoughts on New Zealand, and what strategy would you apply in order to best soften the blow to the New Zealand economy? If if you were the guy in charge, what would you do?
If I was a very difficult question, which is why I'm doing what I do and someone else is prime minister. I think there is, I think, certainly a case to sort of relax the lockdown. I think there's, I think testing is probably the most significant thing that one can do in the short run. I mean, and that is, as I showed in my back of the envelope calculation, you need quite a considerable amount of testing before you can scale down the lockdown. So I think getting testing up and running in short order would probably be the most useful thing. And then I think gradually easing some of the sort of the social distancing requirements would be the next step. I think I don't think easy movement of people is going to happen anytime soon across international borders. But I think for the next 12 months, I think you can largely forget about that. And that wouldn't be the priority. It would be actually getting some of the key sort of the key protections for medium-sized businesses and small businesses out. So rolling out those wage subsidies, making sure that debt holidays are kind of are being arranged with banks and sort of bridging loans and so forth. So essentially, so that businesses can continue to provide the services that they need. I think there's going to be a generalized scaling down everywhere. Everyone is going to have a shrink policy, as it were, and shrink down to some extent, but that doesn't necessarily need to come with large scale job cuts. I think those firms need to be helped in terms of thinking about ways in which they can shrink themselves down without necessarily laying off workers. I mean, that should be a last resort policy, and encouraging that by providing essentially an insurance mechanism, which is kind of what the wage subsidy does. But I think one could probably be much more generous with that. I don't think fiscal policy is an issue here. I think one could be quite. I don't think fiscal profligacy should be a concern for a government at this point. Mm-hmm. So,
including to deal with unemployment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that's probably the most useful thing that the governments can do.
Great. Well, we're going to come to an end now, Prasanna. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, that's all. I hope people found that useful, and it was my attempt to sort of bring some of a lot of things that have been flying around into some kind of framework and order, partly so I could understand it. So this has been very helpful for me, at least. So I hope others have found it useful. They
certainly have. We've received a lot of very good feedback on the webinar that you gave last week. And thank you very much for presenting to the Centre for Supply Chain Management. And we hope to see you again here soon.
Yep, pleasure. Thank you very much, Marcus.
Brilliant. Thank you, Prasanna.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.